The sun beat down hard on the open test range as one of the Army's most advanced hybrid tanks rolled forward, then suddenly stuttered and came to a halt. Technicians rushed in. Alarms hadn't sounded, but the engine had gone dead. Again. This was the third failure that week. The generals watching from the observation deck were not pleased. Engineers from top defense contractors huddled around the vehicle, diagnostic tools in hand, faces tight with confusion. They whispered in code, adjusted panels, rebooted systems. Nothing worked. The demonstration was supposed to showcase progress, precision, and power. Instead, it had turned into a high-profile embarrassment. A quiet tension filled the hangar, broken only by the whir of fans and the occasional clank of a dropped wrench. One officer leaned in to the commanding general and said, "Sir, we've tried everyone. Every expert." The general didn't respond at first. Then, almost to himself, he muttered, "Not everyone." He reached for a phone and dialed a number that hadn't been used in years. Somewhere off in the Arizona desert, a retired Army veteran's dusty phone began to ring. He hadn't expected to ever hear from them again. Not after what happened. Not after the way he was cast aside. But on that day, the Army didn't need a contractor. It needed a miracle, and someone who understood machines in a way no one else could. That's when the story of Charles Chuck Renaer was pulled back into motion. Chuck Renaer wasn't the kind of man who talked much, but anyone who ever saw him work knew one thing. He was born with an instinct for machines. He grew up in a broken foster system, shuffled from one home to the next. While other kids played ball or rode bikes, Chuck found comfort in taking apart toasters, lawn mowers, and old radios, just to figure out how they worked. He could hear what others couldn't, sense the imbalance in a piston or the hesitation in a valve like most people sensed emotion in a voice. By age 12, he'd fixed the laundry machine in the orphanage, something 3 grown men had failed to do. At 17, he enlisted in the Army, not because he wanted a career, but because he needed direction. What he found instead was a purpose. His reputation grew quietly. If a Humvee broke down in the desert or a generator failed during a mission, Chuck was the first one they called. He didn't follow manuals. He felt the machines. But his career ended not with a medal, but an explosion. In 1982, during an experimental engine test, a misfire sent shrapnel through his right leg and left him with a limp and a scapegoat label. The Army cut him loose, blaming him for what they called procedure failure. His pension was thin. The surgeries drained his savings. His wife left 2 years later. Since then, he lived behind an old repair shop, working odd jobs, fixing tractors and bulldozers for folks who didn't ask questions. Every day he carried the silent weight of a legacy stolen, but deep down he never stopped hearing the language of machines. And when that phone rang, something in him, buried deep, stirred. It was just past 9 a.m. when Chuck's old flip phone buzzed on the workbench beside a half-disassembled hydraulic pump. He wiped his hands on a rag and picked it up. "Mr. Renaer," came a firm voice. "This is General Kurtz from Fort Reagan. We need your help." Chuck blinked, not sure if he'd heard right. "I think you've got the wrong number, General." A pause. "Negative. You're Charles Renaer, former Sergeant, Corps of Engineers." Chuck sighed. "That was a long time ago. And yet your name just came up in a room full of people who can't fix our biggest problem," Kurtz replied. Chuck didn't say anything at first. He looked out the garage window, past the rusted pickup, to the wide Arizona dust fields. The last time the military had needed him, they left him bleeding and forgotten. But there was something in the general's tone, a quiet urgency, not command, not pride, just need. "I'm not promising anything," Chuck finally said. "Understood," Kurtz said. "We'll send clearance to the gate. Please come as soon as you can." Chuck hung up and stared at the engine on his bench. He hadn't been on a base in over 2 decades, hadn't worn the uniform, hadn't been saluted, but somewhere, something was broken. And Chuck Renaer never could walk away from something broken. Within the hour, he was on the road, black coffee in a thermos, and his old metal toolbox rattling in the seat beside him. The guard at the base gate looked about 20, his uniform crisp, eyes sharp. He gave Chuck a once-over, taking in the worn jeans, sun-faded shirt, and boots older than the soldier himself. "Name?" "Charles Renaer. General Kurtz said I'd be expected." The guard flipped through a clipboard, brow furrowed. Don't see any Renair here. Chuck stayed calm. Mind confirming with the general while I wait? A few moments and one stiff phone call later, another soldier, a sergeant, walked up and offered a quick handshake. Mr. Renair, I'm Sergeant Harris. I'll escort you. They walked through winding corridors and open grounds. Chuck noticed the younger soldiers staring, whispering. His limp made him slow. Harris kept a fast pace, almost on purpose. When they reached the hangar, 3 engineers in lab coats stood around the tank, frustration painted on their faces. One of them, a balding man with tired eyes, looked up. This him? This is Charles Renair, Harris confirmed. The engineer raised an eyebrow. We were expecting someone more updated. Chuck said nothing. He stepped past them, setting down his toolbox. He didn't need credentials. The tank was a marvel of modern tech. Sleek, silent, dangerous. But it wasn't working. He circled it once. The younger techs scoffed when he pulled out a stethoscope. Yes, the old kind. You're really using that, one whispered. Chuck didn't answer. He crouched, listened, tapped, felt the hum and pause of the machinery. The others saw junk. He heard a stutter in its heartbeat. He didn't need to explain himself. The machine would speak for him. Chuck worked without fanfare, running his fingers along the mounting brackets, listening for the subtle whine that came and went with heat. Every few minutes he'd tap, tilt, or adjust, occasionally muttering something to himself. The engineers looked on impatiently, exchanging glances. One of them finally said, "We've run every diagnostic." This isn't a carbureted truck from 1972. Chuck said nothing, continuing his examination. 20 minutes passed before he stopped, straightened up, and wiped his hands. It's not the engine, he said. Excuse me? It's the integration system. The engine works fine until it heats up. Then a micro vibration forms in the mounting base, throwing the synchronization between combustion and electric drive out of phase. The engineers scoffed. We've tested the mounts. At what temperature? Chuck asked. Silence. Exactly, he said. You tested them cold. Factory specification. But this hybrid system builds thermal vibration that doesn't show up unless it's at full operational heat. The bald engineer crossed his arms. That's just a theory. Chuck nodded. Then you don't need me. You already know everything. He packed his tools and walked out, his limp visible in every step. No one stopped him. Outside, he sat in his truck, hands resting on the wheel. He wasn't mad, just used to being doubted. He'd done his part. Now they could choose whether to listen. Hours later, his phone rang again. It was Carson, the lead engineer. Mr. Renair, I owe you an apology. You were right. We heated the system and found the vibration, exactly where you said it would be. Chuck said nothing. Carson continued. General Kurtz would like to speak to you in person. The next morning, Chuck returned. This time, they were waiting with more than questions. They had respect. The general stepped forward. Sergeant Renair, he said, using the title with purpose. You just saved a multi-million-dollar project. That engine uses dampers based on your old designs. We didn't realize we were solving your problem with your own blueprint. Chuck's eyes didn't water, but something softened. Carson stepped forward, less like a scientist and more like a student. Mr. Renair, I truly apologize for the way we treated you. We thought you were outdated, but you saw what none of us could. Chuck gave a small nod. I've been underestimated before. General Kurtz cleared his throat. Sergeant, I have to ask, a man with your skills, would you consider rejoining the system, even in an advisory role? Chuck looked at the tank, then at his own hands, scarred, steady, and tired. I appreciate the offer, General, I really do. But that chapter closed a long time ago. I'm not that man anymore. The room was quiet, not awkward, just respectful. With all due respect, Kurt said, you still are that man. You always were. The system just forgot. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope. This is for your time and for the recognition you should have received years ago. Chuck didn't take it right away. He studied the envelope. I didn't do it for this. I know, Kurtz replied. That's why you deserve it. Chuck finally took it and slid it into his pocket. Not out of greed, but as a gesture of closure. For the first time in decades, he felt seen, not as a liability or a relic, but as a master craftsman, someone whose knowledge wasn't rusted with time. It had been waiting quietly to be called upon, and when the time came, it answered. The next morning, Chuck was back under the hood of a tractor, fine-tuning its hydraulics with the same care he'd given the tank. The desert sun was rising slow, casting gold across the fields. A black SUV pulled up quietly. Carson stepped out, this time alone. "I had to tell you something in person," he said. Chuck looked up but didn't stop working. "Go on." Carson walked closer. "When you caught that vibration, I realized how much I still have to learn. We measure knowledge with degrees, awards, and data. But what you have, that's deeper. It's lived. It's felt. It's earned." Chuck nodded once, then looked out over the land. "Machines always give you a warning," he said softly. "But most people don't listen. Not to the sound, not to the person who hears it." Carson extended a hand. Chuck took it. Firm, quiet, final. As the SUV rolled away, Chuck stood still. Not for praise, not for regret. Just reflection. Some men build legacies in silence. Others rediscover them in moments that matter. And sometimes when the world forgets your name, it still remembers your work.